With that, I think I should move straight on to welcoming Ra Page as our first speaker. As you heard, Ra is the CEO of Comma, and has been involved in authoring many books, and we're going to hear much about your talk today, which is, now I should read what I've been told. Ra is going to be talking about science versus science fiction, the dawn of justice.
Cheers.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. As you heard, I'm a publisher. I founded a short fiction publishing house based in Manchester, which concentrates on short stories. And so I'm not an academic, so my talk today will just be a bit of fun, full of inaccuracies, oversimplifications, and nonsense. But I thought I'd just spend this session just talking about the relationship between science and storytelling. We all know there's some very good examples of how science fiction has influenced science content and vice versa at a content level. But I thought I'd talk a little bit, or have a little bit of fun, comparing structurally the stories that science fiction tells and the stories, in quotes, that science tell. And my contention is that science tells stories. I don't mean fibs, I just mean sort of narratives, just as much as fiction tells stories. So I went for the naffest title I could think of, inspired by the naffest film out at the cinemas at the moment. These are just 5 examples of books that we've commissioned. I'm really interested in science realism. Science fiction often doesn't need to have much kind of science reality in it. And if you sort of step back and look at the vast majority of popular science fiction, there isn't actually a lot of range or diversity when it comes to the science content. You could summarize it as artificial intelligence, time travel, space travel, and genetic engineering. There's more to science than those 4 cliches, or those 4 big topics. Science is almost infinitely broad. So I was very keen with these books, starting with this one, When It Changed, on the left, with Jeff Ryman, who edited that one for me, just to pair writers with scientists of all different types, so not just in those 4 obvious areas. And what they did, it was like a blind date. A scientist met a writer, the writer tried to get their head around a particular bit of research, incorporated it into their story, tried to be inspired by their particular research area or specialism or idea, and then write a short story, and then the scientist sort of kept an eye on it, made sure the story didn't veer into bad science or any kind of science non sequiturs. And then at the end of it, when the scientist was happy with the story, the scientist writes afterwards, responding to them and explaining the science behind those stories for the general reader. So as anthologies, they've all got different themes, but they feature fiction and non-fiction. So you read a bit of fiction and then you read the real science behind that fiction and the real research, and in an accessible way. So the first book was about research generally. Litmus was about the history of science and eureka moments, discovery moments in the history of science. Biopunk was about bioethics. Beta Life was about artificial life, artificial intelligence, robotics, complex modeling, etc. And Spindles was about sleep science. So the 2 questions I'm going to ask today is, how does fiction incorporate science, and how does science incorporate fiction? And by fiction, I mean story. So I guess I should start by saying, what do I mean by story? First of all, it's simplified. It's never the whole picture. It's never the whole kind of analysis of what's going on. It's a simplified, linear, minimal cast narrative. And I also think it's defined by a 3-act structure, a minimum of 3 acts. But I'll go back to that. A complex narrative is not the same as a story. I don't think we can, as human beings, relate to a complex narrative in the same way we relate to normal stories. By complex, I'm sure you all know the difference between complex and complicated. But this was an interesting analysis of the film Inception, the Chris Nolan film, which is quite a complicated film. There's lots of different layers of sleep. There's lots of different characters moving backwards and forwards. It's not told in a linear way, but the brain, the human brain, knows time only one way. When you go into a story, you can experience a story like Pulp Fiction or whatever, and your brain knows time very, very well. So it just reorders everything. So you're so familiar with the one-dimensional linearity of time, you can watch a very unlinear film, and you're perfectly capable of sort of reordering it in a linear, chronological way. So this is a complicated narrative. It's not a complex narrative. A complex narrative requires, obviously, feedback loops, and it needs to have the possibility of going back to the beginning. So this is an example of a complex narrative. I did see a much more interesting picture of a complex narrative. It was about the population of deers, but this one, I couldn't find it on the internet last night. So this one is the success or failure of an insurance company. It's very, very dull. But you get the idea. There's lots of feedbacks. You can't start at any one point. And if you imagine, just to go back, I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember Choose Your Own Adventure books, where you'd read a couple of pages and it gave you a choice. You can go, if you want to turn left at this point in the road, go to page 47. If you want to turn right, go to page 58. It was a really interesting idea as a series of books. The book as a whole is a complex narrative, but any particular read that you do is a story. And that's how I'm defining story for this point. Likewise, a computer game, you can play a computer game a million different ways, but and as a whole, it's a complex narrative. But any one play is what I would call a story. So that's just how I'm defining story. So what's this 3-act structure about? I don't know if anybody's done any basic script writing. I'm sure you're all familiar with this idea that any story can be resolved into 3 acts. The great kind of narratologist Robert McKee, who lectures and kind of mentors lots of Hollywood screenwriters, says that any film, any narrative can be resolved into 3 acts. Any act can be resolved into 3 components. Any scene can be resolved into 3 bits. And even, he says, any beat within that scene has a 3-act structure within it. It has a recursive sort of structure. And the idea of this 3-act structure is there's tension or conflict. Then there's the second act is escalation. It gets a bit worse. Third act is some kind of resolution. It doesn't have to be a positive resolution. It could be like King Lear, where everybody dies. But it is a resolution. The problem no longer exists. Why 3? Why not 2, you may ask? In a way, I think just really, this is, as I say, very, very simplified. Why 2? If you have 2 acts, then you have basically a problem and a solution, or a resolution of a problem, and then the problem goes away. There's no danger in that. There's no risk. There's no sense that things could go wrong. There's no uncertainty. You know it's going to be resolved. You know it's going to, or there isn't even any time or space within that for that uncertainty. In American dramas and in lots of obvious sort of structures, narrative structures, there's always an all is lost moment where the character falls on their knees. It's usually raining. There's a shot from above, and they scream to the skies. There's always an all is lost moment where you think everything is lost, and that's what the second act is about. This sense that all is lost, and it looks like it's going catastrophically wrong, but there's still uncertainty. So it needs to have three acts, I would say, if it's a story. So let's go back to how fiction incorporates science and how science fiction has incorporated science. It has been suggested that that this could be simplified into 2 kind of world views. Science fiction, the entire canon, can be resolved into 2 different categories or camps. And these are the camps of Jules Verne's version of science fiction and H.G. Wells' version of science fiction. I'll talk a little bit about science metaphor and the scientist as a character as well. Jules Verne was a realist. He loved the problems of science. He was a problem solver. Wells, on the other hand, was perhaps more of a social commentator, and science wasn't so important, or scientific realism wasn't so important. So they had a disagreement, and they had a little bit of a rivalry going on. Jules Verne was maybe 30 years. His writing was maybe 30 years, came 30 years earlier than H.G. Wells. But they didn't. They kind of represented two different polar opposites, if you like. Verne said of Wells, it occurs to me that his stories, Wells' stories, do not repose on very scientific bases. No, there is no rapport between his work and mine. I make use of physics, he invents. I go to the moon in a cannonball discharged from a cannon. There is no invention. He goes to Mars in an airship, which he constructs of a metal, which does away with the laws of gravitation. Ça c'est très logique, but show me this metal. Let him produce it. It's kind of quite strong, that. Wells is a little bit more diplomatic when he talks about Verne. And he says, this is writing after Verne, I think after Verne's career is over, after Verne's passed away. He says, his work dealt always with the actual possibilities of invention and discovery, and he made some remarkable forecasts. He's being diplomatic. The interest he invoked was a practical one. He wrote and believed and told that this or that thing could be done, which was not done at the time. He helped the reader to imagine it done and realize what fun, excitement, mischief. Note those words, fun, excitement, mischief. It's not really heavy literary words. It's not like Shakespeare we're talking about here. They're fun and they're exciting, they're mischievous. What fun and excitement and mischief could ensue. Many of his inventions have come true, but these stories of mine, this is in the preface to a collection of his work, do not pretend to deal with possible things. They're exercises in the imagination. There's a hint there that what he's interested in is a higher art, and they belong to a quite different field. So, to summarize, Verne felt that Wells utilized science. He was a mercenary. He used it solely for the purpose of science, for the purpose of the story. There's this quote which I found: Wells was a mercenary when it came to science. He utilized it as a new magic, a new fantasy, a just so story, which he could use to peddle his particular social criticism. So, in a way, it's just a magic wand, or it's just a device, it's just an instrument for Wells to make his social critiques. On the other hand, fans of Wells have said, Verne was just a fetishist. He just fetishized science. He's just all about the science and the tech. He's a techie. He's a nerd. He doesn't have much to say about society or humanity. It's just, to go back, it's just fun. It's a bit of excitement, etc., etc. And the difference between the two has been summarized as Verne wrote about technology and Wells wrote about science. But that is a Wellsian interpretation of the two, or simplification. So not everybody might be that familiar with Verne's stories. So if you think about modern day or more recent examples, I'll come back to this actually. Well, if you think, did anybody see the Martian film, the Andy Weir's novel and the recent Martian film? That is an example of science can fix it. Science has solutions. We can survive. We can deal with this. We can handle this. It's a very positive approach to science. It's very fun. And that's a typical Vernian approach. So Wells used science fiction, or these allegorical futures, or these mad scientist stories, or whatever, to talk about society now. And he said we should fix this problem that we have in society now. Whilst Verne foresaw problems, foresaw challenges, and said we can fix this in the future. So for Wells, it's a moral, societal, human problem that he's thinking about, and it's a problem which exists now. For Verne, it's a logistical problem, and it's probably a problem which we'll encounter more and more of in the future. If you categorize science fiction, the whole history of science fiction, which I'm doing for fun here, into these two different types, schools, Wells seems to have won. Both popular science fiction uses science as a convenience. How many space films or space operas or space series have you seen where everybody walks around in spaceships? There's no mention of lack of gravity, or it's done away with a convenient sort of artificial gravity device or whatever. It's a convenience. It's not about scientific realism in popular sort of thriller, action-based science fiction stories and films. At a literary level as well, Wells won. If you look at writers like Philip K. Dick, who talk about existential fears of when it comes to robots, or if you look at the dystopian writers, Huxley, Orwell, etc., etc. Again, scientific realism isn't really important. It's not a priority for these people, for these writers. I say for the most part. So for the most part, we want to be entertained by science fiction and maybe occasionally morally educated or morally engaged, morally questioned by the more literary of these writers. But we don't want to be scientifically educated by these stories, particularly. So it seems, on the whole, Wells's version has been more dominant. Wells won, or did he? There have been occasional kind of paradigms in which the Vernian approach, the scientific realist approach, has been prominent and has been sort of top dog. One of those periods was the post-war period. After the Second World War, science was heralded and championed as a nation-state building kind of force. It was going to rebuild economies. It was going to take our country, our nation, and this is true in Europe, and it's true in America. It's going to take us into a bright new future, and science was the solution to that. Science offered a panacea. So a lot of writers that were read at the time took this approach. Arthur C. Clarke was absolutely one of those, and Isaac Asimov was one of those type of Vernian writers, where it's about solutions. It wasn't about allegories or social commentary. It's about practical, pragmatic solutions. When Isaac Asimov talks about robots, he's not like Philip K. Dick. He doesn't say, oh, it's just an existential kind of nightmare. Let's just run away from this because it's horrific. He talks practically in I, Robot, in his collection of stories. He comes up with a protocol, a societal protocol for dealing with robots. You tell these robots they have the 3 laws of robotics, and they're not going to hurt us, and they're going to obey those laws. It's practical solutions. It's pragmatic, and it's about moving forward. I would contest that we're entering into another Vernian paradigm at the moment, another Vernian moment with a kind of renewed interest in scientific solutions, and The Martian is one of those, and it's been propelled a little bit through with the aid of certain films which have kind of fallen in love with space again, and I would say this is possibly a kind of reaction to the recession. We need solutions, we need hope, we need kind of fantasy, if you like. We need kind of aspiration, and science and technology is one way of doing that. In the early 80s, there was a big kind of a big winter when it comes to research. There was the beginning of the AI winter. All the research funding was taken out of academia, was taken out of research institutes, traditional academic research institutes, and it kind of went into business. So science was kind of relocated, or a lot of the emphasis was taken away from academia and went into kind of large corporations and private interests. So at that point, a lot of hope, a lot of public hope, a public kind of anticipation sort of died away. But I think we're now entering another period where, for lots of different reasons, there is this new faith in science as a solver, as a solution to our problems. And you see it everywhere. I was watching a very very low quality horror film, 10 Cloverfield Lane, in which you can see Andy Weir, you can see the Martian solution, sort of problem-solving ingredient just scattered around. It's all about practical kind of resourcefulness and invention and the power of problem-solving. So I think we're entering a new Verne era. So that's kind of a quick summary of scientific narratives. I'm running out of time quick. This is another example of how science fiction uses science, and this is as metaphor. So I've quickly gone through some examples of how particular bits of theory might be used. So we commissioned a story which looked at special relativity. Adam Marek wrote a story which looked at time dilation, and in his story Lightspeed, he uses time dilation as a metaphor for a marriage breaking down. So one character is a pilot and has to go shuttle backwards and forwards to Pluto at near light speed, and he literally ends up on a different wavelength to his wife, and it's all about the breakdown of their marriage because of the time dilation. And special relativity becomes a metaphor for marriage breakdown. There's another famous novel, The Forever War, where a bunch of soldiers go off to a distant galaxy to fight a war, and when they come back, the time dilation effects act as a metaphor for alienation of soldiers coming back from a war. So real science can be used, real good, hard, accurate science can be used as a metaphor. Likewise, future technology, good examples, well-researched, scientifically accurate examples of future technology can act as a metaphor. So we commissioned a story called Swarm, which was about nanotechnology and nanobots, which was written by a Syrian writer, and he used Swarm nanobot technology as a metaphor, set in the future, but as a metaphor for the sarin poison gas attacks that Assad was inflicting on people of Syria at the time. This was a couple of years ago. There's lots of other examples. Stanislav Lem uses nanotechnology as a metaphor in this future history that he writes called Upside Down Evolution. He uses it as an example of as a metaphor for the Cold War and for paranoia. There's all these insects flying around that are spying on people and spying on the other side. So again, it's scientifically accurate metaphors for what's going on now. So I'm trying to sort of break down the Wellesian, Vernian dichotomy here. Larger scenarios, future tech-enabled situations or societal allegories. Again, we can see what the metaphors are. Frankenstein, science is a metaphor. It's a metaphor for man's kind of hubris and arrogance, or science's arrogance in the way it's replacing religion. The Time Machine is a really, really clear, obvious allegory for the class system. If you go into the future, the upper classes and the lower classes in Britain have actually evolved into two different species. It's a criticism of what happens now, what is going on now for Wells, and it's using technology, it's using the future as a way of talking about the present. War of the Worlds is about colonization and empire. At the beginning of War of the Worlds, Wells effectively says, we did this to Tasmania. There are no more Tasmanians. They died. The indigenous population of Tasmania died in 1880, whenever it was, or 1860s. Why shouldn't Martians do it to us? It's a very, very simple allegory. It's a very, very simple criticism of what is going on in Wells's time, in the present rather than in the future. Battlestar Galactica, the 2004 series, was all about the Iraq War. I mean, it's a very, very obvious an allegory for the Iraq War. They were responding almost on a weekly basis to things that were going on. And pretty much all of Philip K. Dick's short stories, at least, talk about the march of government and the march of unaccountable kind of bureaucratic entities through robotics or through artificial intelligence. So I've had put together a quick list of ways in which scientists as characters are represented. We all know about the mad scientist, the main villain, and I've got some wrote a list of examples for these. Yeah, they need no introductions, really. Dr. Jekyll, Victor Frankenstein, Dr. Faustus, Dr. Prospero, Dr. X, all doctors, no professors, Dr. Moreau, etc., etc., etc. The maverick hero who's always fighting the system. He's never like a collective hero. He's never like a team player. He's always the one that everybody thinks is insane. Examples of those are, there's a film called Medicine Man, starring Sean Connery. It's about a guy in the jungle trying to find, a guy in the Brazilian rainforest trying to find a cure to cancer. There's the story of Lorenzo's Oil, which was based on a real life story about two parents who come up with discover a cure for their son's rare condition. Tony Stark in Iron Man is a maverick scientist hero, I would suggest. Bruce Banner, the Hulk, again, And it's been interesting that these superheroes have been resuscitated recently, and maybe they're part of this new Vernian wave. John Nash in A Beautiful Mind, he's obviously a maverick hero, not so much working against the system as working against his own sort of consciousness. Other examples are the faithful assistant. So you might think of Q in Bond films. You might think of Alfred in the Chris Nolan Batman films. David Hodges, the lab guy in CSI, who's always given too much information. Scotty and Bones in Star Trek, etc., etc. There's lots of examples of the scientists as faithful assistant. There's examples of the benign but pretty useless scientist, the failed assistant. Dr. Brackish Okun, which is the Brent Spiner character in Independence Day, the guy who's been in Area 51 for 20 years, who doesn't get out much. There's lots of examples of those. The Cassandra character, or as I call him, the Jeff Goldblum, who's a scientist who always says, "I told you so. I warned you. You wouldn't listen." There's lots of examples of those, but most often they're played by Jeff Goldblum. Independence Day and Jurassic Park being obvious examples. To the founding father, maybe Prospero in Tempest. The Tempest is essentially a science fiction play. Dr. Hammond, which is the Richard Attenborough character in Jurassic Park. Maybe somebody set out with high morals or high ideals, and everybody else has got to deal with the consequences. There's the departmental hero as well, which is probably a subset of the founding father. And there's examples of these sort of character archetypes, if you like, turning from one to another. So often you get in environmental science fiction stories or environmental disaster films and narratives, you get somebody who starts off as a Cassandra character. Somebody who says, "I warned you." You know, Cassandra was this character in the Trojan myth who said, you know, the Greeks are coming, and nobody listens to her. And then she says, "I told you so." Often in environmental stories, you get scientists who say, you know, there's an earthquake coming, or there's climate change coming, and nobody listens to them. And then it all goes wrong, goes pear-shaped, and then they transform from a Cassandra character to like a savior, to a hero, a maverick hero. So you get the characters sort of moving from one of these archetypes to another. But it's interesting if you look through them, which of the Verne or Wells archetypes, or which of the Verne or Wells worldviews they belong to. I would say that the mad scientist is very much a Wellesian archetype. The maverick hero is very much a Vernian archetype, because he's all about coming up with solutions. The faithful assistant, again, is a Vernian archetype, because it's about solutions, it's about things that we can fix. And the benign but fairly impotent assistant is Wells, and so forth. So you can categorize them, and often science is presented negatively in the Wellesian worldview and positively in the Vernian worldview. I then thought I'd ask this question, and I am running out of time. How does science incorporate fiction? Or how does science incorporate story? And now I'm going really off track, and this may be complete nonsense. But I thought about considering scientific explanations and scientific narratives and having a look at them and seeing, are any of these story-like? So the deductive nomological model is a classical philosophical kind of explanation of scientific explanation. So in the deductive nomological model, you come up with a hypothesis, you then come up with an axiomatized conditional, which says if A, then B. And then you go through an infinite number of A's, i.e. the initial conditions, and you look for a negative result. So if a version of A, your initial condition, produces something which isn't B, fails to produce B, then you've got a refutation of that theory. So that's the deductive nomological model. In real life, we use probably something closer to the inductive nomological model, which talks about statistical kind of balance of likelihoods, et cetera, But we're talking about stories and simplified narratives here, and the deductive nomological model, DN model, is very much a simplified narrative. There's also the paradoxical or the refutational thought experiment, which says, right, you've got this hypothesis. I'm going to think of an initial condition or a scenario in which your hypothesis doesn't produce the result which you claim it will. So this is either paradoxical, so it produces a paradox. So the Galilean thought experiment, which was this idea that if you dropped, people believed that heavier things fell faster and accelerated at a faster pace than lighter things. So Galileo came up with a brilliant thought experiment where he sat in his chair, he didn't need to do the experiment. He says, well, if you've got a heavy object and a light object, you tie them together with a spring, then taking the system as a whole, the whole thing must fall faster, according to this old theory. So you drop it off the leaning tower of Pisa, the whole thing falls faster. But if the heavier thing at the bottom is falling faster, falling at one speed, and the lighter thing at the top wants to fall at a slower speed, then it will be dragging the heavier thing back. So collectively, the whole thing falls at a slower speed. So you've got two results from the same belief, which are paradoxical. So one way of looking at it, the whole thing, the system as a whole falls faster. Another way of looking at it, it falls slower. It must fall slower. So you get a paradox, so it must be wrong. So that's a paradoxical thought experiment. A refutational thought experiment is one like Maxwell's demons, which tries to come up with a scenario in which the second law of thermodynamics doesn't work. So you have a little demon opening a door between a hot gas and a cold gas. And whenever a hotter particle from the cold gas gets near it, opens the door, it goes in to the hotter gas. So in this scenario, the hotter gas gets hotter and the colder gas gets colder. So it's kind of little thought experiments that try to disprove the theory. And again, they're quite story-like. And then there's the interpretive thought experiment, which is an example of which is Schrodinger's cat. It doesn't disprove anything. It just illuminates or highlights a counterintuitive element to it. So you expand quantum physics to a macro level, and suddenly you've got a cat which is both alive and dead. It doesn't disprove anything, but it makes you think there's something wrong here. This can't be right. Then often you get philosophical kind of scenarios which use science. So ethicists used to come up with this scenario, if we found a gene which made us more likely or very likely to murder somebody, if we did this in the future, it would be decades, hundreds of years into the future, what would we do about it? How would we respond? Would we say those people that have committed murder and have been found to have the gene, should we give them more lenient sentences because they couldn't help it? Or should we go around, scan everybody for this gene and throw them in jail before they've done anything? And the point of that scenario is science doesn't come up with an ethical kind of response. It's ethically neutral science. It doesn't tell us which of these to do. This was a kind of a thought experiment 20 years ago. It's actually now come true. There is a genetic basis for psychopathy, and it has been identified. And again, we're in this situation. What do we do about this? We don't know. Science doesn't offer us a moral or societal response to that problem. Another example of the stories that people tell, or scientists tell, is the Eureka myth. Science is really complicated. Nobody can really understand it, and it only took one genius to come up with a solution to move it from one paradigm to another. And he was sat under a tree, or he was on a tram looking at a clock. Science comes up with these amazingly dramatic eureka moments, which are very, very simple. Newton suddenly, the apple landed on his head or whatever. Einstein was on a tram in Bern looking at the tower thinking, what if I was chasing a light wave? He was 16 at the time, blah, 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 blah. According to the classic kind of historical history of historians of science, they're very revisionist about these stories. Apparently, eureka myths don't exist. If you study the record, if you study the kind of historical evidence, they were made up. They were made up 20 years later, often by the scientists themselves. They're heuristic rather than historical. They're devices for teaching stories, not in any way related to what actually happened. Science moves collectively, it moves incrementally, and it moves very, very, very slowly. even for the individuals that are responsible for the big movements. So eureka myths are complete myths, they're complete fictions. Another example is the extended metaphor. So you can imagine when Brian Cox talked about the collapse of a star in his wonderful BBC series, Wonders of the Universe. He went to a prison in Brazil, which was about to be destroyed, about to be kind of demolished. And he talked about the amazing history of the star imploding in terms of different layers of this huge prison that was about to be demolished. And right in the last scene, he walks towards the camera with his hair blowing in slow-mo, rock and roll music, and the whole thing collapses as it's blown up. It's nice, and it's dramatic, and it has that kind of story feel to it. But these are just, maybe this is an example of stories which we tell. It's an extended metaphor. I don't know if it qualifies as a story. So in this is almost my last slide. In this slide, I don't know if you can see it at all. I can barely see it. I've looked at each one of these types of stories, and I've said, is it a story? Does it have a 3-act structure? The DN model definitely does have a 3-act structure. The paradoxical refutation thought experiment does. The interpretive thought experiment, the Schrödinger cat thought experiment, doesn't seem, well, yeah, it has a sort of a 3-act structure, but you're just left with this sort of intuitive sense of rejection. The philosophical scenarios, there is really no 3rd act. The Eureka myth, absolutely this is a story. This is an amazing story. And you can see the 3 acts, that you've got the maverick scientist with this hunch that this theory isn't wrong, the current paradigm is wrong. Then you've got the 2nd act, which is the resistance of the scientific community, and the lack of empirical evidence for this hunch. And then finally, the 3rd act, you have the resolution, you have the flash of inspiration, you have the Rodin statue when he's sat there, and then suddenly a little light bulb appears above his head. It's absolutely a 3-act structure. And the extended metaphor, there's no inbuilt need for the extended metaphor to have 3 acts, so I don't think that quite qualifies. So I just thought I'd compare those 2 sets of stories. So science as it features in fiction, and fiction as it features in science. The top one is science fiction, Wells and Verne, and the bottom one is science stories, as I've whittled them down to the 3 different types. And I've asked some pretty vague questions. What is the imperative of these stories? Obviously, you as a reader, it's ambiguous, and if it's good literature, it's totally ambiguous, man. You have to work it out, man, but it's actually pretty obvious. And with Wells, the imperative, as I said, the imperative is, the problem is now, the type of problem is moral, and the imperative is we should fix this problem with the class system, we should fix this problem with colonialism, etc. We should fix this problem with science replacing religion or science becoming over-ambitious. Whilst with Verne, there will be a problem soon, environmentally, or we will be able to fix this problem of space flight or air flight, etc., etc. And if we ask the question of when these problems are, with Wells it's very much now, with Verne it's very much the future. And if you ask the question of where are these decisions made, with Wells it's an intuitive, it's kind of sense, it's a moral, it's internal, it's individual. It's your personal inbuilt sense of morality which should be responding to War of the Worlds or responding to colonialism morally. Whilst with Verne, these solutions are out in the world, and the world can fix them. If you look at the science stories, if you like, again, a lot of the kind of when do we need to solve this problem? It's often in the future with a deductive nomological model. Deductive nomological model doesn't always come up with a solution immediately. It says, if you haven't found a negative result, keep looking, keep looking, keep looking. And if you do find a negative result, then you need to start again. You need to rebuild an entire new theory. So the emphasis is very much in the future, and the decisions about those conclusions are made out in the world, whilst the more interpretive thought experiments, certainly the ethical ones and definitely the Schrodinger's cat kind of thought experiments, they're all about intuition. And you may say this third one doesn't belong in science, but Einstein himself was all about intuition towards the end of his life. He had a real problem with quantum mechanics. There was something fundamentally wrong with action at a distance, which quantum mechanics seems to suggest. You measure, you have two particles, they fly apart to the other ends of the universe, and it's only when you measure one that the other one instantaneously decides what it wants to be through the kind of measurement problem. So how can there be instantaneous action at a distance across the universe? Einstein had a real problem with that, and it was an intuitive problem, and he was driven by intuition to come up with loads of kind of arguments against quantum mechanics. So it's there in scientific kind of methodologies. It's very much embedded, this intuitive kind of internal response. And we just need to be aware of it. I've run out of time. Any questions?
Thank you, Ra. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed that. We have time for some questions. And I believe some people walking around with microphones in the middle.
One here, one there.
But,
so, do you, as a publisher, do you think, other than entertaining, that science fiction has other responsibilities? Like, should it educate or should it critically question science as on an ethical basis, for example?
Absolutely. I have loads more slides, obviously. I think there's a massive responsibility for the two disciplines to talk to each other. Here's a sort of scenario. Again, it's very simplified. Because in the 80s, science sort of went into bed with big business. And the humanities and sciences drifted apart in the CP Snow version of the two cultures idea. A lot of people in government, MPs, and a lot of kind of think tanks, consultants, political consultants, etc., come from humanities side, and big business is very much tied up with science. So when a societal problem comes along, which affects everybody, we say to the government, how are you going to help us? And the government are largely humanities graduates. They go, I don't know, let's ask the scientists. And the scientists are in bed with large corporations, private interests. So a public problem instantly gets deferred to private corporations. And that's an example, because of this division, because humanities and sciences just don't talk to each other. And I think it's a fundamental kind of political problem. And it's in everybody's interest to talk to each other. And it's in everybody's interest for the scientists and the humanities, the arts graduates, the historians, etc., to constantly be engaged with each other, to integrate socially, etc., because otherwise you just get people deferring the decision, really important decisions, and you can't actually follow the line of power, if you like, in those scenarios. So it's massively important. And there are periods when governments have put all their money into one or the other, and it's usually at the moment in recessions, and certainly at the moment all the funding is in science, and there's very little funding in humanities. So and it's not like humanities are going to die. Admissions are still huge for humanities subjects, but the gap, the gulf between the two is ever widening, and the less they speak to each other, the more kind of problems we have, I think.
One more. In the front here.
So the philosophical thought experiment is a really weird literary genre, because you can have a very successful story which is just a few paragraphs long, and the shorter and more poignant it is, the better. But it seems like the real story occurs around it. You want to have a punchy example, a little short science fiction story in your example, and then you spend the endless amount of papers talking about it. It's almost like the introduction, and afterward to the story is where the real job gets done. And indeed, it doesn't even need to have a proper point in itself. You give it points from the outside. So it's very different from normal fiction, where the reader is supposed to afterwards put down the book. And now he's finished with the book. He might be thinking a bit about it, but not the point that it's ongoing.
Well, I think short stories, you're totally right. I think short stories work more like poems in that you read them, you think, what happened? Something happened. And you then spend more time, if you ever read Dubliners or, classic, great, modernist short stories, modern 20th century short stories, or Chekhov, you think about it for a lot longer than you read it. And you think about it for days. There's a Chekhov story called Misery, which is 4 pages long, and I still think about it. I still think about it a lot. Whilst novels, you kind of want to spend your time in this place. It's like a holiday. You want to have an excursion to this other world, this other context, and you enjoy the time that it inhabits and the time that you inhabit this space. But it's more over when you finish it. But a short story is more like a poem. You have to go back to it. You have to think about it. You have to try and unpick what happened there. And that's exactly how it works when a thought experiment is. A lot of these more inconclusive thought experiments are used. And we're doing a whole anthology of thought experiments where we've given writers, we've paired writers with philosophers and physicists, because thought experiments seem to be very popular in physics, very popular in philosophy and ethics, and nobody else uses them at all. And it's an interesting area. But yeah, there's a fantastic thought experiment called Mary's Room, which was invented by an Australian philosopher called Frank Jackson, and he invented this idea of this woman grows up in a locked room and she only ever sees black and white things. She doesn't see any colour at all, and she studies and she becomes an amazing student. She understands light, she understands physics, she understands chemistry, she understands colour, but she's never seen colour. And it's a physicalist, it's an argument against physicalism that says when she leaves this room and sees colour for the first time, she learns something new, which she couldn't have learnt in the room. And Frank Jackson invented this 20 years ago, and now he's actually disagreed with it, and he's actually contradicted it and undermined his own theory. 20 years later, he's actually become a physicalist. So these things are completely inconclusive, and that's what's interesting about them. But then that's what's interesting about good stories. You can go back to them and see new things in them. So I think they both work in the same way, in that way.
Okay, I'm afraid in the interest of time, we should draw the discussion to a close. Thank you very much, Rob. I really enjoyed it.